Yeah, we're all good. So welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Claire Foster and I am the event director here at Type Books in Toronto. And I'm so happy to welcome you this evening to the virtual launch of Her Turn by Katherine Ashenburg. For this event, Katherine will be in conversation with Judith Pereira, arts editor at the Globe and Mail. And before I turn it over to Lynn Henry, publishing director at Knopf Canada and editor of this book, who will then introduce Katherine and Judith, I have some preliminary notes to go through before we begin. This event, I know, has many people tuning in from all over the world, but I want to let everyone know that Type Books is an independent bookstore in Toronto, Canada, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that Type Books, where we are selling this book, is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you're tuning into and listening from as well. Finally, I'd like to clarify that this is a webinar, which means that while you can see us, we cannot see you. So please feel free to participate by putting in some questions in the Q&A bar down below, as well as the chat, and we are going to do our best to get to all of them. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lynn Henry, who, as I said, edited this book, and we'll take it away from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, so I'm Lynn Henry, the publishing director at Knopf and the very happy editor of this book. And the first thing I'd like to do is just add my welcome to that of Claire from Type Books. I think one of the rather nice things, despite all the challenges that we in publishing have learned over the past 18 months, is that people still do show up, and sometimes they show up more keenly than ever to literary events, even if, and sometimes especially if, they are virtual. And this is just such a heartening affirmation of the power of drawing words and people together. And so I thank you for being part of that important affirmation and being here, each and every one of you. So I've been thinking and musing casually over the past few days about how to talk about Katherine Ashenburg and her fiction. And there were two words that kept coming to me, whether I was thinking about this on a walk or sipping a cup of coffee or tapping away on my computer. And those two words were surprise and delight. And then this morning, I finally got down to real work, and I went back to check my notes to see what it was exactly that I had written about a year and a half ago when I first formally presented Katherine's new book to my colleagues in sales and marketing, which is what we do when we're marking the start of our road to publication. And I was both immensely surprised and hugely delighted to find that I had started off my little speech by saying to my colleagues, and I quote, "I feel as if almost everything about this unexpected second novel from Katherine Ashenburg is turning out to be both a surprise and a delight." So it's sometimes good, I think, to be reminded that novels, like children, often have a character that seems mysteriously set from the very beginning of their lives. And this appears to be true with Katherine Ashenburg's wonderful new novel, Her Turn. You might ask, why is it surprising? And to answer that question truthfully, I have to briefly go back to Katherine's debut novel, Sophie and Cecilia, which we at Knopf Canada were fortunate to publish maybe around 4 years ago, I think. And the very fact of that novel's existence was surprising in the first place because Katherine, as many of you probably know, had long been a journalist and an editor of a column in a newspaper and had a whole career writing successful nonfiction books. And it seemed that she was very set in that mode of writing. But then suddenly, perhaps a little later in life than most fiction writers, Katherine presented us one day out of the blue with a novel. And not just any novel, a novel set in Sweden. And in fact, in early 20th century Sweden. But there it was, this rich tapestry of a historical novel full of surprising and delightful facts about fabric and art and life for two women, and we could not resist. So far, so good. But then about 2 years ago, in a plot twist, even though those words surprising and delightful had occurred many times by then, I somehow still didn't see coming. Another novel landed quite lightly, almost whimsically, in my inbox with the intriguing title of Her Turn. I was, perhaps needless to say, surprised and delighted. The surprise at first was in how different it was from Sophie and Cecilia. It was short and sharp and wryly funny and contemporary and set in Washington, D.C. in those now innocent seeming days when Hillary Clinton was making a run for the presidency. And the delight that quickly followed was first to realize that Katherine had somehow completely reinvented herself yet again as a kind of Nora Ephron-like writer, and then to see in the pages how cleverly and brightly and deceptively the surfaced breeze of this novel disguised its serious depths. Because, of course, at heart, it is about that most difficult and ancient of philosophical concerns, a concern that can both make and destroy civilizations as well as families, friendships, marriages, and individuals. In other words, the concept and concern of forgiveness. I said to my colleagues when I was giving that presentation about a year and a half ago, speaking in editor speak as I presented the book to them, Katherine Ashenburg proves herself to be disarmingly adept in this more commercial literary space. It feels like a novel she was born to write. But in retrospect, perhaps that was a bit of hyperbole. In fact, I think you have to have lived a bit to write a novel like this. But to circle back finally to those two words that it turns out have kept me company, not just for this long weekend, but for a year and a half, as I've been thinking about Her Turn, I'll borrow a saying that's often applied to parents and children: like novel, like author. Katherine, too, is always a little surprising in the best way, pulling unusual facts out of seemingly thin air or a hidden back pocket or an artfully turned hat. And above all, she is unfailingly delightful as an accomplished author, as a curious, observant, compassionate person, and not least as a wise and gracious friend. Like author, like novel, and I'm very grateful to know both. Before I turn this over to Katherine herself, I'd like to say a few brief thank yous. First, I believe Katherine's US publisher at HarperCollins, Sarah Nelson, is amongst the audience here. And so I'd like to acknowledge her and thank her for the privilege of our collaboration on this book. And thanks too to Hannah Bishop from HarperCollins US, who has been deftly handling publicity and marketing. And then here in Canada, within Knopf Canada and Penguin Random House Canada, I'm joined by my brilliant colleague, Martha Kenya Forstner, who's the publisher at Knopf, and by the whole team, including our wonderful cover designer, Kelly Hill, marketing director, Ashley Dunn, and not least, Katherine's absolutely indispensable, devoted, and incredible publicist, Sharon Klein. And finally, a thank you and brief introduction for Judith Pereira, who's going to take over from me now and lead a talk and a Q&A with Katherine. Judith has worked for many years for the Globe and Mail, a number of them as an editor at the Report on Business magazine, where she won several national newspaper awards. And she is currently books and arts editor at the Globe and Mail, where I know she holds the line bravely in support of creative words and ideas. So over to you, Judith.
Thank you, Lynn, and welcome everyone. We're going to have a great evening talking about Her Turn. As you can tell, I had many things as I was reading through it. I kept putting in little notes to start, but let's start off with Liz, who is the protagonist. Let's talk about how you came up with her. Who is she, Katherine? Is she a composite? Is she you? Who is Liz? And how did you decide on the name?
Oh my gosh, so many questions. I'll start with the last one. I did not want her to be named Liz. I wanted my heroine to have a very classic name like Claire or Ellen, were two I kept trying, but somehow this woman just insisted on being called Liz. And I think it turned out to be good because it sort of speaks to the transgressive nature of Liz. Liz is, if you ask if Liz is like me, she's way tidier, more organized, more conscientious in every way than I am. And at the same time, she's also more transgressive. Well, she has one transgression at the beginning of the novel. She goes on to many more transgressions, but her one transgression at the beginning is that she is a journalist, an editor at a big national newspaper, and she's having an affair with her married publisher.
Right. Okay. So that's the big, as I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, what possessed her to do this? Why would you do this of all the people in the newsroom?
Well, he wasn't the publisher when they got together. He was like the chief financial officer or something. I don't know. Is it the time to talk about Liz and Seamus? Well, let me say some other things about Liz first. For a while, I think in the back of my mind, I'd been wanting to write about a woman who was looking good on the surface, but was emotionally stalled a whole decade after her very painful divorce. But I had just finished writing Sophie and Cecilia. I wasn't planning on starting a novel for a very long time. And I couldn't figure out what the situation would be, what would happen with this woman. So I get some of my very best ideas on trains. And as soon as it's easier to travel, I'm going to take a lot more train rides. I was on a train in England going from Liverpool to the Cotswolds. And I was just looking out the window. It was a beautiful day. And I started thinking about my job at the Globe and Mail, which had been about 20 years in the past when I was the editor of the Facts and Arguments page, which included a personal essay, very much like First Person in the paper today. So the funny thing about my job was that nobody except people at the paper and my friends knew who was editing that page. So I would get, more than occasionally, someone whom I knew would send in a very intimate essay, but they didn't know they were sending it to me. And I remember thinking, never dreaming that I would go on to write novels, I remember thinking Carol Shields would have loved writing about a woman with this job. She would have been brilliant about this woman where it feels like the whole country came to her about their loves and their fears and their shames and their guilt or whatever. So I started thinking about that and looking out the window. And then I realized that Liz, whom I don't think I hadn't named Liz at all then, would have the job that I had at the Globe and Mail, although she does it at a paper which is never named, although all my Washington, D.C. friends are positive it's the Washington Post, but it really isn't.
I was going to ask that. I'm like, is it the Post? Is it the Globe and Mail?
It's just called the paper, and we can talk about that later. So so Liz is going to have the job I have, and she gets a submission, an essay, as a matter of fact, from the woman who was the other woman at the end of her marriage and is now married to Liz's ex-husband. And that situation, in some ways, it just, in terms of plot, which is, I've not been great at plot until this novel, and I'm just so delighted that there's a real plot happening here. It feels so not like me. I guess that's surprising, Lynn, if not delightful. So a section of hell kind of breaks loose. Liz is really destabilized by the other woman, Nicole, being in her inbox, and she starts acting out, pushing the envelope essays into the paper, doing something that I won't go into with her longstanding affair with the publisher, getting interested in being friends and maybe even lovers with people who are sending in essays, which she never would have done before. And so that's what happens with Liz. And that was the sort of setup.
And you said that you were talking about the plot has not usually been something that you get right away. Did the plot then drive the dialogue and how things sort of moved in like you knew what was going to happen and then that's how you wrote it through? Or did you try to write it with dialogue in sections? Do you know what I mean?
No, but I think I know what you mean in the big sense, and I'll try to answer that. The situation was so fabulous in a way that it kind of made its own plot for maybe the first half of the book, or maybe a little further than that. And then I just got really stuck because I'd gotten Liz in so much trouble, and the trouble mounts significantly at the end. And I just thought, how am I going to get her out of this? And that was a huge worry. And I don't know how long that lasted. But finally, one day I was in a hotel and I thought, I'm just going to start. She's going to have a conversation on the phone with the person she's really hurt at the end of the novel. And I thought, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm just going to write dialogue between the two of them. And before I was a novelist, if I'm a novelist, people would say things like, my character did this, and I would just kind of roll my eyes like that was just way too mystical for me, and I didn't believe it. But something like that happened with the dialogue. So dialogue, I have to say, is something I never had any occasion in my life to write, except maybe after skits at summer camp. And it's maybe the part of writing a novel that is the most fun for me. I'm not saying I'm good at it, but I'm just saying that I really enjoy writing dialogue.
Now, you set this novel in 2015, which is sort of the near past, but it doesn't take into account all the messiness of the past 4 years and really what happened last year. Why did you decide 2015 and that sort of just right around there before things all went to heck?
Okay, well, I'm going to back up and say why I chose Washington, D.C. first, and then that is relevant to why it's 2015. I think I took the novel out of Canada, where it would have been reasonable and natural to write it, because it has enough autobiographical elements that I thought, I think if I take this out of the country, I'll be freer, I'll be more able to kind of embroider the little autobiographical glints much more heavily. I just felt it would free me up. But I needed a big city, and I needed a city with a national newspaper. And New York just felt like too much. But luckily, the big city, the American city I know best is Washington, D.C., because I was an undergraduate there and a graduate student. And of course, they have a national newspaper, which is never named. So having set it in Washington, D.C., a thing that I love as a reader is the spirit of place. I love to read a mystery that's set in Edinburgh and learn a lot of crunchy, very small details about Edinburgh, or a novel that's set in Russia. I love that. And obviously a big part of the spirit of place in Washington is politics. And I wanted it to be as contemporary as I could make it, but I knew I could not deal with Trump in the White House. I felt like he would just suck away all the oxygen, and that would be impossible. So I set it as close as I could when Hillary Clinton and Trump were trying to get the nominations of their party. And I think it was Lynn Henry who, at a certain fairly late point, said to me, you need to write more about the coming election, which was an extremely good idea and really kind of grounded the reader in, yes, this is Washington, and Liz is hearing people on the metro talking about, coming primaries or things like that. So that's why 2015. But you're right about the last couple of years just being horrendous. And now I'm doing the same thing again, because I'm writing a novel which is, again, I want it to be contemporary, but now I can't deal with coronavirus. So I'm writing a novel that today, that might change, is set in 2019.
So this is the interesting thing, that I'm wondering if writers are struggling with where to place books that are contemporary. They don't want to go too far back, but to place it anywhere between 2016 to 2021 always just seems so fraught.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I wondered how, what are writers doing? Do they just ignore it? Do they try to? Yeah, I don't know how you ignore something like that, though.
No. And my hat's off to writers who can deal with it more fully. I just knew I couldn't do it. It's not in my skill set at all, but I'm all admiration for writers who do that.
Now, when you said that Washington really well, did you have to, obviously you were writing this book perhaps in a time that you couldn't go back to Washington. Did you have to talk to people in Washington to confirm things and try to get them to go look at scenes like the brutalist buildings and so on? I'm thinking about.
Right. I'm very fortunate because I have a college classmate from my undergraduate years, who is a lifelong Washingtonian, and she and her husband very generously put me up for about a week. Obviously, it was pre-coronavirus. I can't remember what year it was, but maybe let's say 2008. Yeah, it was 2018, because the midterm elections were happening when I was there. And so I had that week, and it was really fun to build a life for my heroine as a grown-up, because I'd been first a kid living in a dormitory in my undergraduate college, and not much better really as a graduate student. So, and I remember my classmate Jane having a big argument with me, saying, no, somebody who works at the Washington Post, which Liz doesn't, but I let Jane have that illusion, could never afford to buy a house in Washington, D.C. And for some reason, I was very attached to Liz buying a house with her part of the divorce money. But Jane talked me into it, and I found a very good, I thought, apartment for her on Corcoran Street. And then I wrote it, and I sent it to Jane and said, please check the bus routes, check the everything, check the opening hours of the Library of Congress, or, I could have done that online. But so she gave me lots of small corrections. So that's how it came to be as accurate as it is.
I loved that, where you see, because you're right, I love reading novels and getting those little things, like the metro station and, the brutalist buildings, and you kind of get a sense of place.
Right.
So it's always nice to hear how you kind of get the research for that, if it's just all Google, or do you go there, or how do you, and same for being in a newsroom. Did you have to go back to friends in the newsroom to kind of, what's happening in the newsroom these days?
There's something very eternal, I thought, about newsrooms, but I did ask our mutual friend Elizabeth Renzetti, to read it for newspaper accuracy. And for sure, I had some ideas that were very old-fashioned in the, 15 or 20 years since I've left the Globe. But I think to the extent that it is funny, I think that situating it in a newspaper, and I didn't know this when I started, I think that just makes a novel comic, because a newsroom is so filled with driven, obsessed, rivalrous characters with maybe not the world's greatest social skills. This does not refer to anybody I ever worked with at the Globe, but just reading about these people. And they're all, as Liz says at one point in the novel, she was in an atmosphere where everybody at the paper, including the white-haired guys who edited the bird column and the chess column, they all think they're investigative reporters. So the air in which you breathe is cynicism. And somehow that, I don't know, I just found it funny. Or if it's a comic book, I think a lot of it is due to putting it in a newsroom. And the great novels about newsrooms like Scoop by Evelyn Waugh, or yes, The Imperfectionist by Tom Rackman, and Shipping News, they're pretty much comic novels. There's just something about those driven characters that is funny for
Definitely
me.
For The Imperfectionist, I found it hilarious.
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of Liz Renzetti, Liz has sent a question about, and as asked, what was your favorite part of her turn to write?
Oh, I really liked the relationship between Liz and her pugnacious, officious, superior university age son, Peter. I don't know why that tickled me. And also, even though she doesn't want to hear it, and although he voices it very contemptuously, Peter is really onto a lot of what's wrong with his mother. And I have two daughters, and we have a certain family style of talking, which outsiders can sometimes think it's kind of rough. But it's always, we know that it's always affectionate, but I kind of modeled Peter, their dialogue, and especially Peter, on my younger daughter. And by the way, Hannah, happy birthday. If you can see this on Haida Gwaii, hope you're having a great time. So I like Peter very much. I like that relationship. I still get goose pimples when I read the scene where the publisher's wife has found out that he's having an affair with Liz, and Liz is having a nice quiet dinner with her ex-husband in a Greek restaurant, and who shows up but Martha Donovan, the angry but superbly sort of put together wife of the publisher who accosts them, and Liz is completely bewildered ex-husband. So that I kind of like that scene very much.
Well, speaking of that scene, I mean, that the first 30 or so pages when I was reading it, I'm like, how does she justify, this affair? I mean, it was just sort of percolating in my mind, like what would possess her to do this, considering the hurt this woman has felt, with her ex-husband and Nicole. And can you sort of go into a little bit of that, like, because the affair with Seamus sort of started fairly early on. I mean, before any of the sort of before Nicole ever sent in the thing. So what was her, like, why, and what was driving her?
Okay, why? Well, what I think that Liz, like a lot of people probably who are doing something that they know is morally queasy or morally dicey, she tries to ignore it, and habit makes that easier. She also tries to rationalize it by saying to herself, oh, Seamus is notorious for having had many affairs and he never left his wife, so this is all good. We don't actually know that Seamus had many affairs, but that's his reputation. But then at the end of the book, and this is just a little tiny spoiler that I'm going to tell you, because, and I think it's okay because so much happens at the end of the book that I don't mind parting with this information. You learn something about Liz's motivation, which is quite complicated sort of psychologically, but she thinks, if I am as guilty as Nicole and Sydney, and if we're all kind of rowing together in this morally leaky boat, I will be, as they are, guilty, and I won't have to forgive them because I won't be an innocent party who might want to forgive them because I'll be like them. And I think she talks, or she thinks, I'm not sure, about Seamus as being like a big overcoat. And she says to herself, it's easier to have an affair than it is to learn how to forgive. And when she takes that overcoat off, she's all of a sudden very vulnerable, and she really needs to think about Martha, Seamus's wife, and what she's done there, and try to figure out how to forgive Sydney and Nicole. So I think that's what the function of Seamus is.
That's interesting, because I remember reading that, and I've actually got it in one of my notes here, and I'm like, this idea of forgiveness sort of is the huge, I mean, it's the thread that kind of binds this novel together. And so was forgiveness sort of the driving, like, why forgiveness? Why did you decide on that?
Yes, it was the driving thing. And I think a lot of writers decide to write about things that they don't understand and they want to understand. And Liz and I think a lot of people are really confused about forgiveness. What is it? How do you do it? Is it permanent? How do you know if you haven't forgiven? Liz doesn't even know if she's not forgiven her husband and Nicole, and she suspects that she hasn't, and wonders if the fact that she feels so embarrassed and so self-conscious with them is a sign that she hasn't forgiven. So Liz, all by herself, once Nicole lands in her inbox, so she starts goes to this wonderful bookstore in Washington, D.C., Kramer Books, and feeling that she's buying a particularly reprehensible form of pornography, as she describes it, she starts buying self-help books about forgiveness, trying to obey their orders and rituals and tapping and all kinds of things. So she's reading about the sort of psychologist, counselor, self-help side, whereas her superior son, Peter, is a philosophy major. So he tells her the very different feelings that philosophers have about it. And there's one scene where Peter's been explaining to her various things that the philosophers think, and Liz kind of interrupts him and says, but how do you do it? And Peter says, what do you mean? And she says, how do you forgive? And Peter says, oh, philosophers aren't concerned about that. And Liz says, but that's that's the only important thing here. And it's true, she gets no guidance. She's quite confused by all the theories that are kind of roiling around her, but the plot kind of helps her because she's thrown into closer and closer contact with Nicole and her husband, and she gets these flashes of empathy for them. She knows what Nicole is feeling like standing at a party or a gathering with a husband who's completely forgotten her and she doesn't know hardly anybody at the party. She feels a flash of empathy for Sydney when she remembers their first Christmas after separation, when he was weeping on the phone, hearing their then little boy sing, Bring Us a Figgy Pudding. So she has those spots. She also, partly because of Peter, she learns to take responsibility for her part in the end of the marriage, which I think is probably a really big step towards being able to forgive. But she's still very confused. And she's got this great friend, Paolo, who's a security guard, who says to her, just, take what you want from this buffet of choices of how to do it or what it is. And I think you've already done a lot of the work so far. So do Liz and I understand forgiveness better? Sort of, but it's still really complicated and slippery. Like when I think I've got a handle on it, it just kind of can go away.
Well, speaking of Paulo, he was somebody who wrote in an essay, and I guess I want to talk a little bit about the ethics of what she started to do with seeing people who wrote in these essays to us and to her as as an editor, and she met with people about their. She met with twice. She met with people outside of that. So I mean, I don't even like the thing with Nicole was so far. I was like, what are you doing?
Right.
As
Yeah,
a
definitely. That's another thing where she's really so destabilized and so going off the rails. She would never have there's nothing horrible about having made friends with the Dubrofs, this elderly couple of retired dentists, but the Liz in the before time would never have done that. And even more so with Paolo, whom she's kind of interested in. I like it when Peter says to her sarcastically, oh yeah, he's another brilliant choice, a man who's desperately in love with his faithless wife. And she talks to herself about these things. She's never completely in denial, but she's in enough denial that she keeps on doing them.
I actually did love her sort of the rapport she had with Peter, especially toward at the end where he was like, "What are you thinking? Are you losing your mind?"
Yes, right. Yeah. When he keeps getting the news of her getting in deeper and deeper trouble, his emails become extremely sarcastic.
I'm just going to go to some questions now. Here's one from Joanna Schneller. Hi, Johanna. She wanted to know about the joy of writing fiction after years in journalism, to talk a little bit about that, what it's like to write fiction.
Oh, okay. Hi, Johanna. I'm very glad that I wrote 4 books of nonfiction. The nuns told me never to say never, so I won't say that I will never write another book of nonfiction, but I think it's very, very unlikely. I think writing nonfiction to write a really good book of nonfiction is harder than writing a novel, because you've got to have a strong thesis and support it. You've got to build good sentences. You've got to find the right structure and stay by it. You've got to have an interesting thesis and support that, and do tons of research, and everything has to be true. That is a really big list of requirements. I read a review in the Sunday Times this Sunday of a book that's called Drunk, which has a really interesting thesis that throughout history, from the very beginning of fermenting things, generals and kings and chiefs and people like that have understood that people need, in his thesis, strong alcohol to bond together, to fight their separateness, to fight wars, etc., etc. And I read the review and I could just smell tons of research, really interesting thesis, a lot of work. And I'm so glad this guy has done it and I don't have to. I mean, I would read the book happily, but novels, of course, there's hard work. There's the usual self-loathing, the fears, the ridiculous. thing of what am I doing here, etc. And it's hard work, but it's certain parts of it. And for me, it seems to be writing dialogue. It's much more like play than anything I ever experienced when writing nonfiction.
And when you say play, like just fun, you mean?
Just fun, yeah.
Like to go back and forth with the people. Do you hear them in your head, these people?
Dickens did that. I wonder if I do. I guess I kind of do, yeah.
Like they have different voices or different cadence and a way of speaking?
I don't know. That's a good question. Different styles. I'm not sure, but I would know Liz from, say, her friend Honey or something like that.
I can hear Liz. She's very specific in my head. And that's why I was very interested to know if she was based on people you've known through the years or, how, because her voice was so distinctive. And so, I don't know, she just had a very, very strong voice. And it was in my head when I was reading it. So I just wondered if she was real in some ways, which is why.
No, I don't think so.
Although
I got a letter from an email from an old friend in Vancouver this morning saying, aha, I see all those glints of your old gentleman callers. This is the downside of old friends. We remember everything, but really it's, novelists are like magpies. You see something shiny and you steal that, and you see something shiny on another branch of the tree and you steal that. Or as with the Globe, I've had so many old friends from the Globe saying, oh my gosh, that character is X and that character is Y. And they never are. Like I'll just steal, we had this wonderful managing editor when I was at the Globe named Tim Pritchard, who sadly is no longer with us. And he's not at all like Norris. Liz is managing editor, but they both have above their desks in their office a big framed sign that says, what part of no don't you understand? So I stole that from Tim. And there was a guy, I think he was like the head of ops, or I don't know what his title was, but there was a guy in my day who really had a sweatshirt that said, don't tell my mother I'm a journalist. She thinks I play piano in a whorehouse. That was true too.
There's the front of the marble reception area too. It kind of seemed like the Globe.
That is actually the Washington Post. I went into the Washington Post to see their lobby, but which is like hyper grandiose. But yeah, the old Globe had a lobby, a much more downscale version of that. Yeah.
That type of thing. Oh, here's another question. How long did it take you to write the novel? How did the pandemic impact the project?
Sophie and Cecilia took 10 years. Of course, I was maybe learning how some ways to write a novel, and it had 2 heroines in a span of 60 years. This novel, I think, probably took a little around, let's say, 2 years. There's one heroine. The whole action takes only 2.5 months, that was a lot of fun too, to just really, really compress the action and make it so condensed. And it took, about 2 years. And I always say, they say the first labor with your first child goes on forever, and the second baby is born in the cab on the way to the hospital. Well, this is the baby born in the cab for sure. And it was not affected at all by coronavirus, because it was kind of signed, sealed, and in the hands of Lynn Henry before that started.
Okay. And here's a question, and this is funny. How many cuddle parties did you feel you had to attend in order to get that part of your book right? I was going to ask that question, but
you've touched a feeling of guilt, because I did not have to go to any cuddle parties, because people have written such good essays about my night at a cuddle party. And if you go on their official sites and read the rules, like the cuddle lifeguards and the cuddle monials and all the terms that I use, it really wasn't necessary. But I did feel a little bit guilty. Like I thought a real journalist, a real novelist would be going to one of these things.
Well, there was a follow-up to that question. How much research did you do for Her Turn? You did a lot for your first novel. Yeah. What about for this one?
Well, one of the few things I didn't like about writing Her Turn was that there wasn't much research to be done, because it was contemporary, because I'd worked in a newspaper, because I love doing research. So there was Washington. There was forgiveness. I read philosophers about forgiveness, and that was quite tough because they're so divisive and so contentious with each other. I wonder how they go on to forgive in their real lives. But that was about the only, it was really not much research was necessary.
Okay. And this is from Catherine Bradbury. You mentioned Carol Shields. Did you have her or other authors in your brain as you wrote Her Turn?
Well, that's interesting because I don't know why, but I reread more than once her one of her early novels called The Republic of Love. It's a love story set in Winnipeg. And I think I was trying to get something of her stance vis-a-vis her characters, that she keeps enough of a distance that she can be ironic, but it's always affectionate. So I think I was trying to do something like that with the novel. And I never, it was Lynn Henry who first invoked the holy name of Nora Ephron when it was all done. And, from that in my dreams, but I didn't think of Nora Ephron.
And I'm just going to sort of add to that. Are you reading while you're writing a fiction, or do you read nonfiction, or do you just stay away from reading books during the time where you're...
I really stayed away from certain books when I was reading Sophie and Cecilia, because I had the feeling, for example, if I ever read Wolf Hall, I would never keep on writing a novel. So I was really leery of not being influenced, but just being so demoralized by reading something wonderful. But I think that was pretty much over with Her Turn. So I think I probably read my usual diet of mystery stories and rereading and new things.
And what about for nonfiction? Do you read, because of the research, do you stick to what you're doing your book on, or do you kind of go all over the place when you're writing nonfiction?
If I'm reading something for research purposes, I call that work. So
Okay.
even though I love it. And so then I would, read the same kind of literature for fun or for pleasure or for not work in the same way.
Okay. And here's another question. What was the catalyst that made you go from nonfiction to fiction? Why the change?
The short answer is Jane Urquhart, but the long answer, no, I'm going to try to make this not a long answer. I had loved the paintings of Carl Larsson for many years, went to Sweden because my older daughter Sybil was working there, and we went to his house, and I learned that he'd not let his wife paint after they got married. Came home, told Jane about this because we had a little sort of Carl Larsson fan club. And she said, "It's your first novel. It's your first fiction." And I said, "No, it's Jane, you're crazy." But she must have been very persuasive, or it was the right time, or it was the right subject. It took me a while to accept it. And then for 10 years, I would call her occasionally and say, "You've sent me out into this icy steppes of this horrible landscape," etc., etc. But I think because I love reading novels much more than nonfiction, I just never thought I could do it. I thought it was magic in some way, and I still do in lots of ways. Whereas writing nonfiction felt like a continuation of school. You start with a sentence, paragraph, book review, essay, paper, thesis.
Well, as a journalist, it would seem more familiar to do nonfiction than fiction. I do think of fiction, people who write fiction, as they come up with it out of thin air. How did they come up with this idea? And these people, who are these people that they just make them up?
Right. Well, when I first went to the Globe doing your job as arts and books editor, I had a little interview or talk with each of the then largely middle-aged male critics who all had 3 names as far as I could understand. And I said to all of them in our little talks, "What do you hope to be doing in 10 years? And a large percentage said, "Oh, I won't be here and I'll be writing novels." So I think maybe in the art section of those days, definitely that was a goal, which I don't think anybody except John Bentley Mays actually ever did write a novel, but it was, and Robert Everett Green, but it was definitely a goal.
And what about journalism today? What do you you know,
Yeah,
what do you think?
I think it is not a pretty picture. And I think, well, I started to say we're going to miss it terribly when we don't have all the possibilities of informed, researched, thoughtful opinion. But maybe when we die, nobody, younger generations never having known it or not knowing the difference between blogs and somebody who's really an expert in her field. And maybe it won't be, but for us, it seems very dire. What do you think?
I think that I'm not as, I think it will survive in some form. I really hope so, because I still got some life left in me and I want to keep going. But it's different. It's very different now. When I was reading your you do mention Twitter and a little bit, but it's the pace is very different now. And the amount of information coming at you every day is kind of insane.
Yeah.
And I love that there were, because I started at the Globe 20 years ago, and you do have those people who used to be sort of your backup with pagination, with your back desk and those kind of steps. And that's kind of flattened, right? Those people are either not there or they're doing 2 or 3 different jobs. So yeah, the newspaper it's changed a lot, even from 2015, which is when that's only 5 years ago.
Right.
What do I think? I think that we'll keep fighting the good fight. I think there are people who do care and who do like to read it. And we are seeing that people are paying for digital. I hope.
Right.
Is it going to be the same? Probably not, but I don't know.
Right.
I subscribe to a lot of papers, so I'm going to keep hoping there's people like me, and I give it to my nephews and so on, and I'm like, read quickly, read more.
And what do you mean when you say the pace is different?
It's very fast. It's we were always working on deadline. We were always working with a ton of stuff, but you had time sometimes to breathe. I was thinking about this with the summer staff that I went to the Globe last week, and summer staff in the old days would be like, love to chit chat with editors. Now they're like, I have to do work. I'm working. Don't talk to me. I'm working.
Right.
And it's funny because we used to we used to have time to chat and that newsroom culture. We were talking a little bit about that. What happens when that sort of people in the newsroom popping by to just chat and you'd work till 7, 8, go for a drink, but then come back. People don't do that anymore. It's too hard.
Right.
There's too much work, and it's just you're getting it all the time from everything, right? Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, you name it. There's so many people constantly sending you information. So that's the difference.
Yeah.
These days, I think. But I continue to live in hope.
Good. Okay, good. Well, one thing about Trump was he was very good for the circulation of the New York Times and the Washington Post, because we desperately needed sane voices kind of analyzing things. So perhaps that will keep up.
Here's another question, and this was actually something we had talked about very briefly. One of the things, this is from Caroline, one of the things she loved about the novel was the way it incorporated other literary works, The Seagull, but also The Odyssey. Can you talk about Emily Wilson's excellent translation? We had talked briefly about that and just why you decided to incorporate that into the novel.
Well, I'm glad that you're also a fan of Emily Wilson's translation. I read The Odyssey at university, must have been in the old E.V. Rue translation. And then I read it again when I was writing The Dirt on Clean, a history of washing our bodies, because there's so many baths and washing in the Odyssey that it was a very rich source for me. And then, but I thought it was fun, but I thought it was like a boy's own adventure story. And then I read all the press when Emily Wilson published the first translation by a woman in English. There have been Italian and Turkish translations apparently by women also. And so I bought the book, read it, and was just so especially interested in the relationship between Penelope and her son Telemachus, which for me had so much resonance with Liz and Peter, this very competent single mother, a boy, a young man who has to break away from his mother, and whose father is far away and assert himself. And Telemachus takes it out on Penelope by acting as if he's the big guy and she should just go in the house and start sweeping or something. And Peter's attitude to his mother. But there are just lines in it that I just loved. Like at one point, Penelope says, I have lost my lion-hearted husband and now my son at a certain point. And then at another point, Homer says, her house was full of chairs, but she could not sit upright. Telemachus started to say Peter. Telemachus has gone away to find his father, and Penelope is just a figure of loss. And Liz is like that too. So I was very, very interested in those relationships. And I don't know, very early in writing, I just got the idea that he would write, have you gotten rid of the creepy poet? And she calls him Telemachus. And so that started very early in the writing, that connection with the two of them.
That's great. And so Rosemary Sullivan would like me to let you know that she's listening. Just
hello, Rosemary. That's good.
This is from Marina Endicott. I'm wondering what the new book Catherine's working on is about. Is it a research project or one that will be born in the cab on the way to the hospital?
It's like a multi-research project, but what something interesting happened to me in terms of COVID about it. It's about a museum curator who is making a big show in her museum about Dior's 1947 New Look collection, which changed the world of fashion. It goes back into the German occupation of France. It goes forward into museum politics because the heroine works for a museum. So in my usual state of mind, I would have thought fabulous. That's at least a year's reading about Dior, about the occupation, about museum politics. But then we had coronavirus. And although you can get curbside pickup books from Robarts and the other U of T, University of Toronto libraries, it's not the same thing as sitting on the floor in Robarts and paging through those books. And I don't have a car, and I just got so tired of carrying home books that turned out to be useless that I just thought, totally unlike me, I thought, well, I'm not ready, but I'm just going to start writing. And so I did. And so I have been writing, and I'm parts of it are, I'm solid on the Dior. I need some work researching the other things, but it takes place now or in 2019, because that's the date of the show. So maybe it's some kind of cross between Sophie and Cecilia and Her Turn. I don't know.
And hold on, we've just got a couple of questions I'm going to try to get in very quickly. Someone says, what exactly did you mean? This is Barbara Gowdy. What exactly did you mean when you said earlier in this interview that writing nonfiction is different from writing fiction because of the composition of sentences? And I think you suggested that nonfiction sentences are harder.
No, I don't think the sentences are harder, but I think that they both have the obligation to build really handsome sentences. So it's similar in that way, but there's so many other restrictions and demands in a nonfiction book that I think to write a really, really good one is, for me anyway, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, more difficult. And it has less room for play.
Yeah, I think dialogue allows you a lot when you write fiction. It just gives you freedom to move around too, and to get, sometimes when you're stuck, to get things moving,
Right.
I think, but that's just what I would think. From Rosemary, did you find it odd that people will always assume that fiction is autobiographical?
Yes, very much.
Well, this one, I think it's because, it takes place in a newsroom, and
Yes, it takes place in a newsroom. And, I had that in common with Liz, and I had a very awkward divorce. Well, is there ever a divorce that isn't awkward? I don't know, but I had that in common with Liz. And I did I did go on a long walk with my ex-husband who lives in Vancouver at Christmas and told him about the book. And he seemed extremely calm. So that was, yeah, but I've never had to do that before a novel came out.
That's good. And finally, we talked a little bit about forgiveness. I guess there's a question from CJ Campbell about why you decided on something like forgiveness. I mean, I think you touched on forgiveness being such a visceral thing that all of us are struggling with, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, since I had a heroine who was kind of emotionally stalled and was still quite wrapped up in her divorce after 10 years, I thought forgiveness was just, an obvious place to just not just to start, but to continue and to end on forgiveness.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I feel like we could go on some more. Do you want, you were saying you were going to, do you have anything else to add, or?
Well, I was just, if we're really out of time, I just wanted to thank Claire Foster at Tight Books. That was really lovely. And for those of you who live in Toronto and those of you who don't, when you come to Toronto, please go to Tight Books. And everybody at Knopf Canada, the extraordinary Lynn Henry. Before I knew Lynn Henry, I used to love going to book launches where she would give an introduction to the writer. And as you see, she has not lost her touch at that. She's delightful, but I'm not even surprised because I'm so used to it. The remarkable Sharon Klein, my publicist, and the rest of the Knopf people, and HarperCollins Sarah Nelson, who welcomed this book with open arms and asked me some very good questions. Hannah Bishop, my excellent publicist there at HarperCollins, and all the HarperCollins team, and to you, Judith, for really good questions.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really, really appreciate it. Everybody buy the book and buy other books too. Buying books is everyone should do it. Buy more books. That's my end note. And yeah, it's a great book. I hope everyone gets a copy of it and just enjoys it as much as I did. Lynn.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add my thanks. Is it too hokey if I say that this conversation was so delightful and surprising that there's nothing to forgive? Try to draw it all together there. But really, thank you so much. It was just so wonderful to listen to you two in conversation. And Sharon Klein, ever the publicist, has reminded me to say that Type Books, and we thank you as well so much, has signed book plates for anyone who wants them as well.
Yeah, so I'll give the final word of thanks. Thank you so much. And the link to the signed book plates I have put in the chat. So if you scroll up a bit, it goes directly to Type Books site, and they are available for prints on our site. And there are also the books in all 3 of our stores in Toronto. So thank you so much. If that's all, I will sign off and end this event. Thank you all so much. I wish we could all hang out now, but
I know.
Tis the nature.
There was a little part of me last week that was like, oh, I think we're having an in-person event. And then I'm like, no, it's not an in-person event.
Yeah, right. It will happen.
I see that Sam Haywood has just put a comment, and I think a big shout out to Sam, who is the agent.
Oh, I forgot my wonderful agent, Sam. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Congratulations again, Catherine.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, all.